There's a sentence you've repeated to yourself so many times, you've stopped noticing it's just a sentence, not a fact. Today, I want to show you where that sentence came from and how to finally put it down. I'm Brenda. This is Slow Down. Sometimes I think we assume the hardest things we carry are the obvious ones, the responsibilities, the disappointments, the unexpected turns life has taken. But I've started wondering if that's always true. What if the heaviest thing we carry isn't what happened to us, but the story we've quietly built around what happened? Most of us have an inner voice that follows us everywhere. It doesn't usually sound dramatic. In fact, it often sounds surprisingly reasonable. It whispers things like, "You should have done better. You're probably not ready. Other people seem to handle life much better than you." Because we've heard these thoughts for so many years, we rarely stop to question them. We simply assume they're telling us the truth. But are they? I've noticed something over the years. Many of the gentlest, most thoughtful people I meet are also the hardest on themselves. Not because they aren't capable, not because they aren't intelligent, but because somewhere along the way, they quietly accepted a conclusion about themselves that was never meant to become permanent. Maybe someone dismissed their ideas. Maybe they grew up feeling compared to others. Maybe they failed at something that mattered deeply. Maybe someone they loved walked away. The experience itself eventually became part of the past, but the meaning attached to it quietly stayed. A single moment becomes a sentence. The sentence becomes a belief. The belief slowly becomes the lens through which we see ourselves. After a while, we no longer say, "That experience hurt me." Instead, we begin saying, "This is who I am." It's such a subtle shift that we often don't notice when it happens, and yet, it changes everything. Because once a story feels like identity, we stop questioning it. We hesitate before trying something new. We stay quiet when we want to speak. We hold ourselves back before life ever has the chance to. One idea has stayed with me for a long time. Thoughts are not facts. Imagine your younger sister calls you tonight and quietly says, "I failed once, so I'll probably fail forever." You wouldn't agree. You'd remind her that one difficult moment could never describe an entire life. You'd see possibilities she couldn't see for herself. Isn't it interesting how naturally we offer that kindness to other people, while rarely offering it to ourselves? Somehow, when the same words appear in our own minds, we don't question them. We believe them, not because they're always true, but because they're familiar, and familiarity has a quiet way of disguising itself as truth. Maybe confidence hasn't disappeared. Maybe it has simply been hidden beneath years of believing a story that was written during one painful season of your life, a season that was never supposed to become your identity. I don't believe we need to force ourselves to think positively every moment. Pain deserves honesty. Fear deserves compassion. Doubt deserves curiosity. But maybe we can begin with something much smaller. The next time that familiar voice appears, instead of immediately believing it, perhaps we can gently ask, "Is this really the truth? Or is this simply an old story I've been carrying for much longer than I realized?" Sometimes healing doesn't begin with finding a better answer. Sometimes it begins with asking a kinder question. If this is landing with you right now, drop a single word in the comments. Yes. I read every one, because before we can build confidence, we may first need to understand the quiet stories we've mistaken for who we are. I sometimes wonder how many parts of our lives are quietly shaped by moments we've almost forgotten. Not because those moments were the biggest, but because of the meaning we gave them. A child answers a question in class and gets laughed at. Years later, they still hesitate before sharing an idea. Someone pours their heart into a relationship that doesn't last. Without realizing it, they begin expecting every future relationship to end the same way. A person makes one costly mistake at work. Long after everyone else has moved on, they continue introducing themselves to the world as someone who always gets things wrong. The event may have lasted only a few minutes, but the story it created can quietly last for decades. One of the things our minds do best is look for patterns. Once we believe something about ourselves, our minds begin collecting evidence to support it. If we believe we're not good enough, we'll notice every mistake. If we believe we're always overlooked, we'll remember every moment we weren't chosen. If we believe we'll eventually fail, every setback begins to feel like proof. It's not because life is only giving us painful experiences, it's because our attention has learned where to look. Maybe you've noticed this. Someone compliments your work, and you immediately think they're just being polite. Something goes well, but your attention quickly shifts to the one small thing that didn't. It's almost as though the mind quietly filters out anything that doesn't fit the story it already believes. Not because it's trying to hurt us, but because the human brain values consistency. In a strange way, certainty can feel safer than possibility, even when that certainty is painful. These beliefs rarely announce themselves. They don't say, "Hello, I'm a limiting belief." Instead, they sound like common sense. People like me don't succeed. I'm just not confident. I've always been this way. The more often we hear those sentences, the less they sound like opinions, and the more they begin to sound like facts. Who decided that one painful chapter should become the title of the whole book? Why should one rejection define your ability to be loved? Why should one mistake define your intelligence? Why should one disappointment decide what you're capable of becoming? When we look at someone we care about, we almost never define them by their worst day. We remember their kindness, their effort, their resilience, their potential. Maybe the invitation here is to begin looking at ourselves with that same quiet generosity. Not pretending the difficult moments never happened, not denying the pain they caused, but gently separating the experience from the identity we've built around it. Because there is a profound difference between saying, "Something painful happened to me," and saying, "Something is wrong with me." One statement leaves room for healing. The other quietly closes the door before healing has a chance to begin. The past may explain why a story began. It doesn't have to decide whether that story continues, because who you are has always been something much larger than the hardest thing you've ever lived through. Next, we'll look at how confidence quietly grows, not through extraordinary achievements, but through small moments that teach us we can trust ourselves again. A woman once told me she'd spent 8 years not asking for the promotion she wanted, not because she wasn't qualified, but because somewhere along the way she'd decided she wasn't the confident type. She was waiting to feel ready before she'd let herself begin. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about confidence is that we treat it like a feeling we're waiting for. Once I feel more confident, I'll apply for the job. Once I feel more confident, I'll speak up. Once I feel more confident, I'll finally start. But what if confidence isn't the beginning of the journey, but something that gently grows along the way? When we look at people who seem calm, capable, and secure, it's easy to imagine they've always been that way. We see who they are today. We rarely see the countless, ordinary moments that quietly shaped them. The mornings they got out of bed when they didn't feel like it. The conversations they were nervous to have. The mistakes they made. The days they wanted to give up, but chose one more small step instead. None of those moments looked extraordinary, but together, they slowly became evidence. Evidence that they could handle difficult things. Evidence that they could recover after disappointment. Evidence that they could trust themselves. Not believing you'll never struggle, not believing you'll never fail, but slowly discovering that whatever happens, you won't abandon yourself. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, even a very small one, something changes. Maybe you said you would take a short walk today, and you did. Maybe you finally made the phone call you've been avoiding. Maybe you rested when your body needed rest instead of criticizing yourself for slowing down. Maybe you admitted you were struggling instead of pretending everything was fine. These moments don't usually feel impressive, but our minds notice them. Every small act quietly whispers, "You can rely on me." And over time, those whispers become something stronger. Not because they erase the old story, but because they begin writing a new one. Most lasting change is quiet. It happens through ordinary choices repeated with kindness. One conversation, one decision, one promise kept, one fearful step taken anyway, and then another. Little by little, we stop seeing ourselves as someone who only dreams. We begin seeing ourselves as someone who follows through. Not perfectly, simply honestly. So much of what we call confidence is actually trust. The quiet trust that says, I don't know exactly how this will turn out, but I know I'll meet whatever comes with honesty, patience, and courage. It isn't built on success, it's built on consistency. On showing up for yourself, especially on the days when no one else notices. The beautiful thing about self-trust is that it doesn't ask for perfection. It only asks us to return, again and again and again. Every time we do, we place another small stone beneath our feet. Eventually, without realizing it, we're standing somewhere we never thought we could reach. Not because we became fearless, but because we slowly learned that fear doesn't have to make every decision for us. If you've made it this far, you already are someone who follows through. You're still here. That's worth something. If this channel is helping you build that kind of quiet trust in yourself, consider subscribing. Every week I share one more piece of this journey. Next, we'll look at something that often stands in the way of this quiet kind of confidence, the belief that we must become perfect before we're finally allowed to feel enough. If confidence grows through small moments of trust, why do so many of us still hesitate to take the next step? I don't think it's because we're lazy or incapable. I think quite often it's because we've quietly made a deal with ourselves. I'll begin when I'm ready. I'll speak when I know exactly what to say. I'll try when I can do it perfectly. At first, those thoughts seem responsible, even wise, but over time they become a waiting room we never leave. Perhaps perfection has never really been about doing things flawlessly. Perhaps it's been about protecting ourselves from something deeper. The fear of being judged, the fear of disappointing someone, the fear of confirming an old belief that quietly whispers, maybe I'm not enough after all. If we never begin, we never have to fail. If we never speak, no one can criticize our words. It feels safer that way. But safety has a quiet cost. It slowly steals experiences we can never get back, the conversation we never had, the dream we never explored, the version of ourselves we never gave the chance to exist. When a child learns to walk, falling isn't treated as failure, it's simply part of learning. No one applauds the first step and criticizes the second fall. The falling belongs to the process. Somewhere along the way, many of us forget that. We begin expecting ourselves to get everything right the first time, and when we don't, we assume something must be wrong with us. But perhaps nothing is wrong. Perhaps we're simply learning in the same way we've always learned, one imperfect step at a time. What if, instead of asking, did I do it perfectly, we asked, did I learn something today? One measures worth, the other invites growth. One creates pressure, the other creates possibility. Progress allows us to change our minds, to begin again, to move slowly, to rest without believing we've failed. The people we admire most rarely became who they are because they avoided mistakes. More often, they became who they are because they stopped letting mistakes decide whether they would continue. Perhaps resilience isn't the absence of failure. Perhaps it's the willingness to return after failure with a little more understanding than before. Maybe we don't need to become fearless before we move forward. Maybe we only need to stop asking perfection to give us permission to begin. Perfection has been keeping us waiting. Progress has been quietly inviting us to live. In the final part, we'll look at the voices we choose to keep close and how, little by little, we can begin telling ourselves a kinder story than the one we've carried for so long. Perhaps the voice inside your mind isn't trying to tell you who you are. Perhaps it's simply repeating what it has heard for a very long time. Our minds learn through repetition. If we hear criticism often enough, criticism begins to sound familiar. If we grow up feeling that love must be earned, we may spend years believing we always have to prove ourselves. If we live around fear, we may slowly mistake fear for wisdom. The people around us shape us more than we often realize, not because they decide who we become, but because their voices can quietly become our own. Sometimes those voices come from family, sometimes from teachers, sometimes from people who loved us but didn't always know how to love us gently. And sometimes they come from ourselves, from years of repeating the same quiet sentences until they begin to feel permanent. That's why being thoughtful about what we allow into our lives matters so much. The conversations we stay in, the people we spend time with, the way we speak to ourselves when no one else is around. Little by little, these things become the emotional climate we live inside. None of this means we need to remove every difficult person from our lives or pretend everything should always feel positive. But perhaps we can begin noticing which voices leave us feeling smaller and which ones quietly remind us that we are still growing. For years, many of us have believed that being hard on ourselves would make us stronger, that constant self-criticism would somehow push us toward becoming better. But has it? Or has it simply left us feeling tired? Perhaps kindness isn't the opposite of growth. Perhaps it's the place where real growth begins. Not the kind of kindness that ignores our mistakes, but the kind that says, "You made a mistake, let's understand it," instead of, "You made a mistake, something must be wrong with you." One closes the heart, the other quietly opens it. Before we say goodbye today, try something this week. Not a challenge, not a goal, just a small moment of curiosity. The next time that familiar voice appears, the one that says, "You're not enough, you'll probably fail, you've always been this way," pause for just a moment. Take one slow breath and ask yourself, who taught me to believe this? Then ask one more question. Is this my truth? Or is it simply an old story that has been repeated so many times it began to sound like my own voice? You don't have to answer immediately. Some of the most meaningful changes don't happen in the moment we hear an idea. They happen days later, while we're washing the dishes, walking home, watching the rain, or sitting quietly with ourselves for a few unexpected minutes. That's how healing often begins, not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as a quiet shift, a sentence we no longer believe quite as strongly as we did yesterday. A little more space between ourselves and the story we've carried for years. And in that small space, something beautiful has room to grow. Not perfection, not certainty, not a brand new version of you. Just the gentle realization that you were never the story. You were always the person carrying it. And if a story can be learned, perhaps, with enough patience, it can also be rewritten. Save this video. When that old voice shows up again this week, come back to that one question. Who taught me to believe this? And if you want more of this, every week I share one more piece of this journey. Subscribe and tell me in the comments, what's one story you're ready to stop believing? Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, please be gentle with yourself. You may be carrying far less truth and far more hope than you've been led to believe.